Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome you today to our presentation for the Center of Yoga Studies here at SOAS. This seminar, today's event, is one in a long series of workshops, seminars, and lectures that we organize in order to promote and develop the study of yoga here in the UK as well as internationally, and we have done so for many years. That the Center for Yoga Studies was founded in 2016-17, and we have since produced a very considerable range of research projects. We have trained scholars from the MA levels through to PhD and postdoc. And Lucy May Constantini is one of those. Lucy, you started here at SOAS. We're working on the MA. And it's a great pleasure now to have you present for the Center of Yoga Studies. Lucy worked on a PhD focus bringing together yoga and martial arts in South India, and this is today's topic. But we have also very exciting news. Lucy has joined the Mantram project, that is a synergy project funded by the ERC, and she has been appointed as a postdoc working on that. Her topic, though, today is on her PhD research, which I imagine is awaiting publication before long. Lucy, without further ado, I don't want to detract of your time. Please proceed with your presentation today.
Great. Thank you very much, Ulrich. And thank you to you and to Jackie and the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back. And SOAS had an important function in terms of helping me figure out how I could turn this research into an academic context. So I have a lot of heart and recognition for the support you've given me. And I'd also just like to mention Professor Francesca Rossini, who took the time to speak to me and encourage me to apply way back in, I think, 2016 for my South Asian Area Studies Masters. So while I'm on the subject of thanks, and before I turn over to the main topic, my PhD was funded by the Open Oxford Cambridge Doctoral Training Partnership. So without them, it wouldn't have happened. And my fieldwork was in part supported by the Open University's Research Training Support Grant. And I was also supported by the EFEO, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Pondicherry, particularly with regard to manuscript study and in particular SAS Sharma there. And I also have to thank my very long-suffering PhD supervisors, because this was a PhD that required a lot of ethnography in the middle of a pandemic. So it was not an easy process. And they were Suzanne Newcomb, who I'm sure many of you know, and Paul-François Tremlett. And as Ulrich just said, I'm now also working on the European Research Council's Synergy Mantrams project at the University of Vienna. So the title of my PhD thesis, its subtitle was Practice, Context and Text. And this is like a subversion of an often assumed hierarchy in which text usually comes first and everything else serves to explain the text. So I'm going to spend quite a lot of time explaining why in this particular research that is not the case. So I will just share my screen and hopefully that will work. Where are we? And going back. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, that's good. Thank you, Lucy. Perfect.
Okay, great. So the title of this talk, which you probably now are aware of, is Looking for Things That Are Not Visible, the Inner Body in Motion in a South Indian Martial Art. So before I start explaining the whys and the wherefores, I just thought it would be good to set the scene for you. So here's a short clip. Hold on, can I? Yeah. And this was taken during my field work in 2022. So this is at CVN Kaḻarī in Narakav in Kozhikode in Calicut. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't make the sound work. The sound isn't that important, but it does give a nice atmosphere, but I'll just talk over, I'm afraid. So what you can see here is two seniors of this kaḷari practicing the urumi, which is this like flexible bladed weapon. It's a bit like a whip, except it's very sharp. It makes a lot of noise, which you can't hear, but Jackie tells me that we'll put it on the video afterwards. So if you really want to hear what it sounds like, you can check it out on YouTube at all. So this gives you a sense of what a kaḷari looks like, which is the temporal training space in which it's practiced, the dimensions, the packed earth floor, and some of the shape of some of the practice. Okay, so in this talk, I'll be taking you through the research process and findings of my PhD, which I completed at the Open University at the end of last year. Now, the project involved developing a unique methodology that foregrounded the voices of long-term practitioners through durational ethnography and deep grounding in somatic praxis and analysis to examine the relationship between practice, text, and social, cultural, and historical contexts in this martial art. So in this, it aligned with the radically interdisciplinary aims of the Mantrams project, on which I now work at the University of Vienna, in that it challenges entrenched hierarchies of knowledge by attempting to bring the same heft and status to the materiality of embodied praxis and the somatic understanding of practitioners, as I brought to more conventional historical, cultural, and philological inquiry. So one issue with the scholarship that does exist on Kaḻarippayaṟṛ is that it's spread across disciplines that haven't been easily bridged. And this means that there isn't a readily identifiable, coherent resource if you want to find out more about it. So this thesis is my contribution to addressing this gap. So the thesis itself is available open access on the Open University's repository if you want to have a closer look, and it's made up of 7 chapters. So let me just move the screen so I can see. The actual title of the thesis is The Internal Body in Movement in Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, a South Indian Martial Art, Practice, Context and Text. So the first chapter quite conventionally starts with a literature review, but because there isn't a whole load of literature on Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, it also includes what became called a theoretical intervention, and more on that in a bit. The second chapter looks at the methods that I use to investigate the practice. The third chapter is on the world of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, so sets out the history, the social context, the religious context, and the 20th century revival in which Kaḻarippayaṟṛ took place. The fourth chapter is on the kaḷari body and the kaḻari space, so the kaḻari body in its ritual space, how the body is identified and described in Kaḻarippayaṟṛ. The fifth chapter looks at practice. It's called Kaḻarippayaṟṛ Practice, Embodying the Driving Wind. And it's very much concerned with the notion of vayu, this cosmic and subtle wind that the practice is said to harness. The sixth chapter looks at posture, and it's subtitled Understanding the Internal Body in Movement. And then the seventh chapter looks at the notion of knowledge, what knowledge is in a Kaḻarippayaṟṛ context, and how it's transmitted. And the title is Kaļari Vidya and its transmission. So, hold on, I'll just go back to the last slide because we're not getting to this one yet. So the title for this talk, Looking for Things That Are Not Visible, is lifted from something said to me by my principal informant for this whole process. Now, he's G. Satyanarayanan Nair Gurukul, who is the lineage holder of the kaļari in Thiruvananthapuram, Trivandrum in South India, that I've been working with for a long time. So back in 2012, at his suggestion, we first embarked on our co-created, what he called documentation project. Now, when he was talking about looking for things that are not visible, he was trying to explain why so many principles of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ are hard to put into words. while I went on to reflect that the reason such things are not usually visible has a lot to do with our cultural assumptions around bodies and bodies engaged in physical practice in particular. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on my first two chapters, essentially the how and the why of this research. Now, before I began to resituate the research in an academic context, I'd been working in dance, in embodied praxis, performance, theatre, with a bit of journalism in the mix. And I've learned since then, at times rather painfully, that what I thought was obvious and common sense actually needs a lot of explanation and contextualization when you're bringing this material into the academic framework. And I've since realized how important it is to do this because it challenges assumptions we all carry one way or another about bodies and bodies that do physical practice. So I spent quite a lot of time considering how embodied practice has generally been studied and understood in the academy. Now, from the perspective of someone who, until her PhD, considered herself primarily a mover, it long felt to me to be a curious feature of academic discourse that, in order for writing on the body or physical praxis to be credible, it had to make reference to theorists, usually white, male, and dead, who had little experience of or interest in embodied practice. Now, the most obvious reason for this is the split between mind and body in European thought, which, since the Enlightenment, has valorized a male, rational, thinking subject, derogating in so doing its other, which is bodily experience, viewed as essentially feminine, with all the messy materiality and emotion that this is held to represent. So a consequence of this mind-body split and the values ascribed to each is that the study of movement seemed to me to have become acceptable only when iterated in such conceptual, abstracted terms that its relevance to someone moving their actual body in an actual space had felt, when moving my actual body in an actual space, to be at best tangential and often pretty incomprehensible. So on the one hand, all of us in the academy are, to a greater or lesser extent, inheritors of an intellectual and cultural system that assumes a hierarchy of elevated mind, spirit, intellect, apparent rationality, supposedly scientific objectivity, and these qualities are gendered masculine. And then the material world, whose associations are messy, dirty, inert, unintelligent, suspiciously sensual, emotional, are generally gendered feminine. And so proper academic study should be objective, rational, intellectual, and by implication, far removed from all that embodied mess. So, Bell Hooks has pointed out that removing the body, and by implication the subjective I, that this is bound up in establishing power and authority. So she says that the person who is most powerful has the privilege of denying their body, and that the erasure of the body encourages us to think that we are listening to neutral, objective facts, facts that are not particular to who is sharing the information. We are invited to teach information as though it does not emerge from bodies. So a corollary to this is the tendency of researchers to mask any history of practice in their research, at least in part to protect their authority. Now, this is something that Borean Larios and Mark Singleton discuss in their chapter on the scholar practitioner of yoga studies in the 2021, I think, Routledge Handbook of Yoga and Meditation Studies. So there isn't the time and space to go into the arguments in a lot of detail here because I want to leave some time to tell you about the actual Kaḻarippayaṟṟ. But one problematic area I looked at is the relationship of colonialism, Orientalism, and philology, the study of text. Now, a result of this was that texts were reified, as was philosophy, because they were seen as analogous to the European classics, and the denigration also of the materiality of the body and any practice which engages with this materiality. So this view was then often internalized by Indians themselves, evidenced, as many other scholars have pointed out, in the late 19th and early 20th century reconfigurings of yoga and Indian dance in the run-up to Indian independence, and the establishment of the Indian nation state. So an aspect that I hadn't come across in the discussion so far was the role of European aesthetics and what this played in the reception of Indian physical disciplines. So thinking about this in relation to the values bound up in the moving body, now bear with me. So one of the earliest appearances of a colonised body in the Anglophone literary canon is that of Caliban in William Shakespeare's The Tempest, first performed in 1611. Now, he's arguably one of the play's most compelling characters, but it's never clear whether his description as this thing of darkness is a reference to his skin tone or his moral deficiencies. Now, Shakespeare isn't known for his adherence to historical fact, and Caliban embodies an amalgam of early colonial assumptions about indigenous people everywhere, from the Americas to Africa to Ireland, taking in, quote, men of Ind, en route. So while Ariel, who's on the right of your screen there, is the play's favoured slave and is allied to air, with its attendant associations of purity, spiritual and otherwise, Caliban, on the left, is thou earth. And it's this association with earth, in direct opposition to the airy ideals which were to suffuse elite European movement practices, that marked the bodies of indigenous people in the eyes of their European colonisers. So we see this embodied aesthetic play out in that most fetishized of elite Western movement forms, ballet. And so it makes for a useful study of European attitudes to the body. Now, ballet reached a kind of apotheosis in 1832 with Marie Taglioni's performance of La Sylphide, which established the Ballet Blanc, whose very name, the White Ballet, tells us everything we need to know about which kind of bodies were considered suitable to dance it. So countering the, quote, animality, the animal qualities of art's Calibans, the aesthetic of ballet evolved to glorify verticality, imbuing it with associations of ethereal divinity and virtue. So the further from the earth the dancer could get, the better. In short, the ideal mover was an Ariel, not a Caliban, and the less vertical a movement form was, the closer its association with bestiality and savagery, and by inference, the more justified was the vertical mover in subjugating it. And just in case you thought we'd evolved away from this, you can see here how this aesthetic continues in a more contemporary context. So here we have some slides from some more modern ballets. And for a more India-inspired context, a few years ago when I was preparing something on this theme for a yoga teacher training, I put something like beautiful yoga into a search engine, and this is a selection of the images it gave me. So you can see that emphasis on vertical lines and the sense of upwardness. So while this movement aesthetic held sway under the proscenium arches of Europe, Europeans in India were encountering its opposite at every turn. So here we have some images that I've taken from the Hatha Yoga Project's website. The Hatha Yoga Project, as I'm sure you probably know, was a SOAS-based project between 2015 and 2020. And you can see here like a very different aesthetic, the relationship with the earth, the lack of clothing, the lack of concern about dust or supposed dirt, heat, and much less concern with any sense of verticality or upward rising. So in an important counter to the historical assumption that knowledge comes exclusively from a kind of disembodied intellect, I argue that the body and embodied practice are themselves the sites of knowledge production. And in this, I draw on the work of Ben Spatz. Now, he says, embodied practice is epistemic, it produces knowledge. It is structured by and productive of knowledge. Accordingly, an epistemological account of embodied practice is one according to which such practice actively encounters and comes to know reality through technique. So we understand reality through embodied practice, and this is different to a discursive linguistic intellectual knowledge. So turning to ethnography, which is how embodied practice in the Indian context has largely been studied, and considering Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's landmark book, Decolonising Methodologies, in which she pinpoints some of the major ethical issues around research on Indigenous peoples and practices, turning on these questions, which are: whose research is it? Who owns it? Whose interest does it serve? And who will benefit from it? And with the corollary that academia historically deprived Indigenous peoples of any agency over the scholarship about them. So I argue that my PhD project aligns with her assertion that Indigenous methodologies tend to approach cultural protocols, values, and behaviours as an integral part of methodology, simply part of an ethical and respectful approach. One of the most important aspects of this for me, and the ethnographer Daniela Bevilacqua, who studies Indian ascetics, also argues this, is the importance of giving time, of fitting into the research subject's values and customs of appropriate timing and courtesy, instead of trying to shoehorn theirs into some arbitrary research agenda. So essentially, the key argument of my thesis is that Indigenous and embodied practices, in particular Indigenous embodied practices, merit study on their own terms, and that studies on these terms enrich and decolonise hegemonic academic culture. So I draw on Ben Spatz's reasoning that somatic praxis is a site of knowledge production, and his use of the term epistemic to describe the direct engagement with or production of knowledge. So when I use the term embodied epistemology, I refer to knowledge that is generated and processed via embodied praxis, and that is understood through embodied processes. Such embodied praxis involves the entire human organism, and therefore the epistemes, the knowledges it produces, stand in contrast to the mental or rational concepts of knowledge stemming from a post-Enlightenment body-mind hierarchy. So when I use the term embodied transmission, I mean that this knowledge is passed on via somatic practices involving the whole human organism, usually long-term and carefully structured, rather than through discursive or consciously intellectual means, such as speaking, reading, or writing. So in that speech and hearing are also embodied practices, they can make up a lesser part of embodied transmission, whose main conveyance of knowledge is a physical process of practice. So finally, because of all I've laid out regarding the intersection of attitudes towards race and gender and historical perceptions of the body and practice, I argue that paying attention and giving due weight to the knowledge-creating qualities of embodied practice is an inherently decolonial methodology. So therefore, throughout my research, I endeavour to give at least equal attention and credit to embodied and ethnographic elements, as I would to primary and secondary textual sources, and this includes how I list, date, and credit them. I borrow from Graham Harvey's argument that argues for researcher as a guest, and that it's possible to engage in research with people rather than merely on or even against them, to quote him. So he suggests a better model for both theorising and doing research than the tired objective-subjective, outsider-insider, researcher-subject discourse. And that again is a quote from him. And he draws on Maori protocols pertaining to their guests. So what he says is that in this both and experience, there is a sense of being a guest, a respectful but critical, not fully native, but entirely participative person. Once made a guest of a Maori family or community, one does not become, as if by magic, entirely the same. Difference is not collapsed or erased. Rather, it is made fruitful by the negotiated interaction of both or all concerned. So I find this notion of the guest much more useful than the old insider-outsider binary that we've all heard so much about. And finally, a problem that SPATS identifies is that discussions of embodied practices struggle to validate themselves beyond their own disciplines vis-a-vis accepted standards of academic rigor. And so far, they've got no universally recognized epistemological framework of their own. So I suggest that the tools for integrating embodied practice into more conventional academic discourse with an appropriate degree of rigor can be found in the teachings of those embodied practices themselves. These were the ones I'm drawing on anyway, were largely developed in the 20th and 21st centuries in response and counter to some of the problematic movement aesthetics I discussed earlier. In particular, I draw on the insights and methods from postmodern dance of Steve Paxton, Nancy Stark Smith, and Mary Stark Whitehouse's authentic movement. I'm happy to take questions on this later. There's not time to go into it in detail here, but they're all sophisticated somatic trainings that hone movers' capacity for attention and observation of nuance while also fully engaged in practice themselves. And so this is just a selection of images taken from processes that came from these movement practices. And perhaps the most striking difference from some of the images I showed you before is the relationship to the earth and to the floor, and much less interest in verticality and moving away from the earth, and much more interest in connecting to the earth. Okay, so all of this might seem like a really long preamble and justification, but getting back to the title of this talk, I learned that if I'm going to talk about an inner body in motion and how that can be cultivated and observed, then first I have to wade through and unpack all these issues and assumptions. So moving on to the kaḷari. So this is just a little geographical locating. So I first encountered Kaḻarippayaṟṟ myself in 2002 as a dance artist when I took part in an international choreographic laboratory in Bangalore in South India. And the Guru Kaḻ, the lineage holder I currently work with, but before he was actually Guru Kaḻ, came and worked with us for a week. And then in 2010, I went to the kaḷari in Thiruvananthapuram for the first time. And I've been going there ever since. Several extended periods of study and training. In the early days, a few of these were funded by the Arts Council of Wales. So I was going as a dance artist. And in total, I've now probably spent about 2.5 years there over the last 15 years or so. Just to also clarify the term Guru Kaḻ, it's the Malayalam plural of guru, and it's an honorific, and also some people have it as a last name, which can confuse things. But in this context, it means the lineage holder, the person who is responsible for the lineage and transmission of a particular kaḻari. A kaḻari is the temple training area in which the practice of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ happens. So when in 2012, Satyan Guru Kaḻ suggested that we start this documentation project, as he then termed it, and which then grew into the PhD project, it was in response to the discovery that we shared the same sense of searching in vain for our kind of experience in the literature on Kaḻarippayaṟṟ that we'd so far encountered. So from Satyan Guru Kaļ's point of view, this was of the long-term virtuosic practitioner immersed in the tradition his entire life, while my perspective was that of a committed but relatively new student of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, but also of someone engaged in somatic inquiry since she was a toddler, who dedicated her professional life to it so far. So part of the issue, it seemed to us, was that many of those who'd written on Kaḻarippayaṟṟ were so taken by the shock to the body of meeting this demanding physical practice that the acclimatization to it took at least as much attention as the Kaḻarippayaṟṟ itself, and to neither of our minds was this the most interesting aspect. So once a practitioner was past the initial physical difficulty, which might take many years, what was there to say about it? So the research data I worked with to try and answer this question consisted of my own embodied practice of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, my reflections thereon, various texts I gathered and their translations, my fieldwork notes, and audio recordings of my interviews, which were mainly with Satyan Guru Kaḻ. Now, those interview transcriptions came to just short of 175,000 words, so there was quite a lot of material to wade through. Okay, so that's the how and the why, and now on to the what. So, what is Kaḻarippayaṟṟ? Now, it's often used as an umbrella term when discussing the various entwined martial and medical systems of South India. However, these aren't homogeneous. They operate under distinct ritual systems and lineages. They work through different languages, usually Malayalam or Tamil. They have different pantheons of deities, and they base themselves on different medical systems, Ayurveda or Siddha usually, but there are some overlaps. So my area of research is, quote, actual Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, often termed Northern style or Malabar Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, as opposed to what is sometimes called Southern style or more properly Varmakalai. It gets its name from its origin and development in the Malabar region of northern Kerala, and until the 20th century, its geographical spread was confined by the Arabian Sea to the west, the mountains of the Western Ghats, and the Korapura, which is a river that flows through Kozhikode district and which created its southern boundary. So its language of transmission is Malayalam. Oh, and just so that you know, the area on the map that I've shaded in blue is a rough approximation of this geographical spread of historical Kaḻarippayaṟṟ. So the language of its transmission is Malayalam. Its medical system belongs to the Ayurvedic family, and its founding stories teach that the practice originated with the legendary wave of migration from North India, when the axe-wielding incarnation of the god Vishnu, Parashuraman, made his way south, discovered the land of Kerala, and subsequently entrusted it to various Brahminical families, teaching them the martial art, which he then commanded them to preserve and pass on in order to protect their new land. So whatever the contested validity of this story, it's significant to our understanding of lineage in Kaḻarippayaṟṟ because it sets up a tradition of somatic transmission through time via Guru Shishyan Parampara, so teacher-student transmission, according in however complicated a manner to a Brahminical authority. So, as is often the way, dating the beginnings of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ is extremely difficult. Probably its richest textual evidence comes from the Varakan Patukal, Northern Ballads, which are oral tales from Malabar sung by agricultural workers to accompany their labour. The scholar K.S. Matthew makes a convincing case that of these, the heroic accounts of a probably exaggerated golden age of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ date from between the 15th and 17th centuries CE. And while it's likely that Kaḻarippayaṟṛ is older than this because the practices they describe are clearly very well established, evidence is scant. So whatever its earlier history, we know from the Varakan Patukal that kaļaris, the temple training place where Kaḻarippayaṟṛ is practiced, were intrinsic to social, ritual and educational life of medieval Malabar, that many, if not most people, learnt it as children, girls as well as boys, and then that certain boys, either because of their prowess or social position, would then go on to become professional warriors, either serving in or leading their overlords' armies, or else making their names as the champions tasked with fighting the ritualized public duels that were used to settle political disputes at the time. So these are just some images I found which were made by travellers, European travellers going through the Malabar region in the middle of the last millennium. And then here we have some early 20th century representations of some young Naya girls and women. Now, the Naya community is one of the communities in Kerala which is most prominent in transmitting and preserving Kaḻarippayaṟṛ. So this is just to give you like a visual sense of where we are. So the 18th century witnessed the collapse of Kerala's long-standing martial system. Already it had been forced to adapt to the advent of firearms and the changing nature of warfare, for which its traditional embodied techniques were not designed. Then came a traumatic humiliation inflicted by Tipu Sultan's forces at the end of the 18th century. This prompted the British East India Company to offer to underwrite the military security of the southern princely states. Now, this was not the generous offer it might initially sound, because the tributes for this protection then drained these states of the resources they needed to maintain their own forces. After 2 rebellions in the first decade of the 19th century, the British compelled them then to disband their armies and dissolve their kaḻaris, and then went on to ban the manufacture and ownership of weapons among the local population. So for these reasons, by the beginning of the 20th century, the traditional practices of the kaḻaris were, in Satyan Gurukal's words, nearly extinct. However, there was a revival, thankfully, and it was spearheaded in large part by these 2 people. So in the split here, you have Chambadan Vida Narayanan Nair, who gave his initials to the CVN lineage. So this is CVN. And to his right, crouching down, is his teacher, who was Kotakal Kanaran Gurukal. And between them, they're really credited with, first of all, bringing the practice out of the kaḻaris, because until that point, Kaḻarippayaṟṟ only happened in the enclosed space of a kaḻari. So you couldn't see it except on very limited occasions, and there was very limited space. So very few people could come in and see a kaḻari even on those occasions. So they essentially made performances out of it and took it into performance contexts, toured Kerala and then eventually India and eventually internationally. And I have written about this in a book chapter recently. So if you're curious, I can tell you about that in the Q&A session. But really that was on the role of performance and Kaḻarippayaṟṟ and its revival. So the 3rd chapter of my thesis focuses on this context and history of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ. The first section examines Kerala's early history, the role of a text called the Keralolpati in providing the foundation story of many Kerala practices, including Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, and also the political context in which it operated in the early medieval period. I draw a lot from the scholar Keshavan Velutat on this, so my thanks to him and his considerable scholarship on the area of kind of South India during this period. I also consider the role of trade, colonial encounters, the changing political landscape that led up to Kerala as a state in independent India. And I look at early evidence of Kerala's martial practices and consider the northern ballads, the Varakan Patukal, and what they tell us, and also what they tell us about the role of women and family structures around the kaḻaris. So something else that I look at in this chapter is the emergence of tantric religion and praxis and its particular Kerala manifestation. Also the substratum of Sankam religion with its fierce and feminine powers and how this overlaps with the Shaiva Shakta pantheon we find in the installed deities of a kaḻari. Now, this is the western wall of our kaḻari at CVN in Tiruvananthapuram, and this just gives you a sense of how and where the deities are installed. So in the left-hand corner, which is the southwestern corner, is the Putara, which means flower platform, and that's where the presiding deity of the kaḻari, which is a male-female amalgam, is installed, Kaḷabhairava, Kaḷabhairavi. Then next to that, you can't see it so well, but there's a little lamp by it, is the Naga Devata, the serpent deity. And then a bit further along is Ganapati, Lord Ganapati, the Ganesha, the remover of obstacles. And then the next along is the Guru Pitam, where the lineage holders, the teachers of the kaḻari, are installed. And in the right-hand corner is a Kerala deity called Anti Mahakalan. Then as you come back, the next corner you have Bhadrakali, and in the northwest corner you have a Kerala deity called Vetai Korumakan. And then you can also see that big painting on the western wall is a painting of that picture of Kotakal Kanaran Gurukal and CVN. And the current Gurukal at the kaḻari, so Satyan Gurukal is CVN's grandson. So we have this Guru Shishyan Parampara, this hereditary transmission happening. So Finally, in that chapter, I look at the 20th century revival of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ and I compare it to revivals of Indian dance and yoga. So it's a very long chapter and it probably should be just a book on its own. So then the fourth chapter looks at the kaḷari body and how it functions in the ritual space of the kaḷari. So it explores the ancient Indic notion of body as world, its roots in the Rigvedic hymn of the Purusha Sukta, the cosmic man, whose body creates the universe and everything in it, and then the tantric mappings of universe onto body and also onto ritual space, and how this applies in the kaḻari. So I explain how the kaḻari functions as a temple, its layout and deities, and I also lay out how the kaḻari body is described in its medical texts and by its practitioners. I also look at how the female body operates in the kaḻari and how we negotiate that, and also the kaḻari body in practice. So a few of the findings of this are that the language of tissues, waste products, and humours belongs firmly to the Ayurvedic concept of the body. I've kind of drawn some images here just to vaguely, these aren't from the kaḻari, these are, but just to give you a sense and something to look at. So we have this Ayurvedic body on the one hand, but also in the kaḻari system's approach to wind or breath, with its lexicon including the terms vata, vayu, prana, and shwasam, the Ayurvedic model overlaps and at times gives way to the physiology of Tantra. We see this also in the installed deities of the kaḻari adharas, or what you might know as the chakras, which follows the 6+1 model that Alexis Sanderson has noted only originally occurred in the Kaula cult of Kubchika and the cult of Tripura Sundari. So this association also points to the tantric underpinnings of the CVN lineage. So another finding, and very important, is that the material physical body is understood as a tool to access a subtle inner body. And the key to this is vayu, this subtle wind, which circulates through the body's systems of nadis, these channels of energy, if you like, in the body. So the notions of the body and space show Kaḻarippayaṟṛ to have been clearly part of the tantric currents of second millennium South India. So Satyan Gurukul, in our discussion, said to me that kaḻari is essentially a science of the nadis, that the spinal energy is being charged by this practice. And I understood over time that when he calls it a spinal practice, or he talks about spinal energy, what he's referring to is this energy that is made to circulate through the nadis, and in particular Mahanadi, which is both the spinal cord in the kaḻari body, but also Sushumna Nadi. So this is really important to understanding how the body functions and how the practice is said to access the subtle aspects of the body. So the next chapter, chapter 5, looks at the Kaḻarippayaṟṛ training system, and this essentially boils down to moulding the outer physical body to access, harness, and cycle Vayu, the cosmic wind that we first see articulated in the Vedic hymns, which was then developed over different tantric, yogic, and medical contexts. And if you want to know more about that, I refer you to Kenneth Zisk's work on the subject, which is pretty exhaustive. So, Satyan Gurukul said that the process of Vayu is internalized in a traditional practice where you are becoming one with your Vayu so that you have better control of your body without being aware of it. When your form becomes correct, your Vayu becomes right. That's the way it's designed. So there aren't any overt like pranayama or breathing exercises, but the understanding is that through the practice of the form, the Vayu becomes right. Okay, let me just check that everything's all right. Yes. Okay, good. And if your Vayu becomes right enough and you become a very virtuosic practitioner, you can maybe look like this. So up in the air is Satyan Gurukul, G. Satyanarayanan Nair, And then on the ground with his sword perfectly in line with his back leg is Enrich Gurukul, who's the senior teacher of the kaḻari that I train at. So Satyan Gurukul explains that what for him makes Kaḻarippayaṟṛ a shastric discipline, so he understands it as a shastra, is the codification of its training system. And so just in brief, the practice system falls into three strands. So you have the meitari, which is the body process. Me in Malayalam means body. And this is made up of 5 components. You have chuvata, the action of the feet, nilla, stance, nikam, which technically is a stance and then the transition into another stance. So it's 2 stances or postures and the transition between them. Then you have arapa, which is like a phrase of nikams, and then adava, which we often call mepayat when we're practicing. And adava are long sequences that we use to practice, to develop skills, stamina, control, and so forth. Now, of these, there are 4 chuvata, there are 4 foot patterns, 8 leg exercises, 8 postures, 8 vadivas, and 12 adavas plus 1 that was created during the revival of Kaḻarippayaṛṛ by Sivian and Kottakalkanara and Gurukul, so a more performative adava, which was created in the 20th century. So once you've reached a certain level of expertise with the meitari, normally you'd be introduced to the kaḻari, which is the wooden weapons process. Now, the 3 most emblematic weapons of this are the ketukari, which is a long stick, the cheruvadi, which is the short stick, and the otta, which is curved like a buffalo horn, essentially, and it's known as the master weapon of Kaḻarippayaṛṛ because of the complexity of its movements and how the curving of the otta mirrors the curving and circulating of the spine and the spinal energy. So all the weapons have 12 adavas, except for the otta, which is special and has 18. And then you might move on to the ankatari once you've got to a certain level with the kaḻari, and the ankatari means the battle weapons. So that's the process of the metal weapons. These all have 12 adavas. There are lots of different ones, and different systems use different weapons, but the really iconic ones are sword and shield. There's the urumi, which you saw in the first clip. There's the dagger. There's the spear. So those are some of the battle weapons. Now, the point of all of this in cultivating and harnessing vayu is to create certain qualities in the body which are first cultivated during the leg exercises, which are the first thing any student will practice. So I took this video, this is Sharat Lal, in April this year. So I filmed him because I thought he was nicely illustrating some of these points. So here he is, practicing the circling leg, which is one of the 8 leg exercises. And just things that I think are worth noticing here are the quality of centering, the sense of control. He's about to start again now. And that there's a lightness and a precision to his movement and an ease and a lack of force. And that also you get a sense in this of the like stereotypical kaḻari body that is cultivated through kaḻari practice, which is not an overtly muscular body, but tends to be a long, lithe body and also a soft body. It's a practice which, if you're doing it correctly, is supposed to keep the body soft as well as strong. So thank you to Sharat Lal for that demonstration. Oops. So one of the things that Satyan Gurukul said to me during our conversations was that traditionally it used to be like you are aiming at something much, much higher than just doing a weapon. Eventually, this shell-like outer thing will not last. If you don't have a root form, root understanding of what happens in the body, how the body is relating to the weapon, that kind of training, you will definitely lose it. Because the outer shell is just like a shell. It will break away very fast. It changes. But the root tradition, root understanding, root fundamental principles don't change. And that is the one which gives to you. And by this, I understand it to mean this harnessing and cycling of vayu in the body, which is that which generates the energy and the force of the practice, as opposed to any kind of overt physical force. So, in chapter 6, I zoom into an element of the practice, which is the varivukal, or the postures. And now this is the chapter which most features kaḻari manuscripts. Satyan Gurukul gave me an overall description and explanation of posture from his CVN family manuscripts, as well as descriptions for 2 of the postures and 1 of the mantras that is associated with a particular posture. So here you can see a little bit, this was when he wrote out Ashwavadiva for me. So it's actually one of the treatment tables, you can see those are his father's notebooks. So that's his father's manuscript, and he's copying from that into my notebook. So that is how I then got Ashwavadiva. I wasn't allowed to look at his father's book. That's not for me to look at, but he copied out a selection that he chose and he put it in my notebook for me. So the overall description of posture ends with this particular phrase. So it goes, Varivingal urachulil kumpol, nabi molatingalum, pine unnukalilum, nanai shwasate urapiche, balamnerna, kolukayum venam. And that means when firmly in the posture, by firming the breath, specifically in the nabi mulam, and then in the grip of the feet, you must obtain the power. So the first thing to say, those of you who are used to a yoga body, is the nabi mulam in Kaḻarippayaṟṟ is not at the navel. So the nabi mulam in Kaḻarippayaṟṟ is a point in Muladhara. So it's just underneath the perineum. So it's a low point in the body. And what you're looking at here is this sort of suction action of the feet gripping on the floor as they sort of grip and suck up on the floor, mirroring the physical action of the perineum, that same sense of lifting. So you've got these mirrored arches lifting, and a focusing of the attention and the breath to these points. And it's this point, the nabi mulam and the suction of the feet, by focusing the breath in that, the practitioner circulates vayu. And it is this that creates the power in Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, not, it is said, any overt physical force. So just to give you a quick idea of what some of the postures look like, there are 8 postures. This is Gajavadiva, elephant posture. And then we have Simhavadiva, lion posture, various iterations of. Another Simhavadiva. Ashwavadiva, horse posture. More Ashwavadiva. Now, a couple of the postures, Varaha, boar posture, and Sarpavadiva, don't have any still points in them, so it's hard to think of them as postures. But this is the beginning of Sarpavadiva, so these young women are moving into it. So from there, they turn under and through their legs and come out the other side, essentially. So this is snake posture. Then Marjaravadiva, cat posture. Kukkutavadiva, so Anup Raj on the left, that was taken just about 2 weeks ago. And I particularly like his very accurate left big toe. And then on the other side is me in 2012, where the big toe is not so accurate. But yeah, 2 pictures 13 years apart. And Matsyavadiva, fish posture. So those children are working on getting that side knee down. So the knee should not be flaring out, but they're still learning. And yeah, so those are the 8 postures. So then in chapter 7, I focus on how knowledge is understood and transmitted in the kaḻari tradition. So the nature of the somatic knowledge of the kaḻari and the theory behind it is enshrined in the figure of the Gurukul, the lineage holder, also in the kaḻari lineage manuscripts, as well as wider tantric norms, and then the embodied practice itself. So chapter 7 examines how this knowledge and its attributed intrinsic qualities are understood, particularly the key aspect of yukti, namely what is joined to create knowledge. So yukti is understood as the combining of learnt knowledge to the intuition engendered by long-term repeated intelligent practice. And it's what allows the kaḷari physician to connect to the embodied experience of a patient to treat him or her. And it's also used to describe the underlying principles that interweave to make up the kaḷari shastra, the codified knowledge. So I explore the nature and function of a kaḷari guru, the role a student plays in the transmission of Kaḷarippayaṟṛ, and this includes translating and describing a section of text from the CVN manuscripts on how to choose a student. And this is me receiving that piece of text and what it looks like in my notebook. So I then deconstruct ideas of how secrecy plays into the notion of esoteric knowledge at the kaḷari, and I describe various ritual modes of transmission and the role of mantras therein. And finally, I discuss the most important annual ritual, Kaḷari Puja, which happens towards the end of Navaratri every year. So there are 2 nights and 2 mornings of rituals and a ceremonial recommencement of learning. So this is on the 8th night of Navaratri, the first night of rituals that we have. This is the Bhagavati Seva on Navami, the 9th night of Navaratri, at which point the kaḷari is very full. It's a very big occasion. You can get a sense of it there. And then Vidyarambam, which is the ceremonial recommencement of learning, where every student pays their respects to the guru, receives his blessings. Everything is practiced, all the weapons are demonstrated, and anything that somebody is going to be learning in the coming year is initiated and given at this particular ceremony. Okay, so to conclude. Now, when we first embarked on our tentative co-created documentation project, as we then called it in 2012, Satyan Gurukul in particular worried that if we couldn't find a range of ways to articulate Kaḻarippayaṟṛ's less visible aspects, some of the knowledge would soon disappear altogether. His concerns helped shape my thesis's main argument, that embodied and indigenous practices deserve study on their own terms, and that studies on these terms enrich wider scholarship by challenging assumed and entrenched hierarchies of knowledge in the academy and the power dynamics of authority in discussions around them. Now, this approach counters Kaḻarippayaṟṛ's twofold marginalisation, first from the concerns and preferences of academic Indology, and second in the priorities and values of the 20th century Indian nationalist movement, both of which prioritised practices they could frame within Sanskritic authority at the expense of vernacular, textual and somatic traditions. Examining embodied and indigenous praxis on their own terms is fundamental to a fuller understanding of the traditions we research, because without properly including practitioner voices, knowledge can only be partial, and some of it risks being lost altogether. I don't pretend that my study magically renders knowledge of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ perfect and whole, but it at least fills some significant gaps. The viewpoint of lineage holders of kaḻari traditions is important for scholars to take into full account in discussions of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ practices, because in not attending to these, key aspects of these traditions have been overlooked. An insistence on contextualizing Kaḻarippayaṟṛ within pan-Indian literary, cultural and political trends at the expense of thorough localized analysis risks missing the granular detail of Kaḻarippayaṟṛ's place in the fabric of Kerala's unique sociological, religious and cultural developments. These local factors have important implications for how Kaḻarippayaṟṛ conceives of the internal body in movement, which is the title of my thesis. This is an aspect of the kaḻari tradition considered foundational by Satyan Gurukul, but that has only been discussed in fairly general terms in studies to date. Such an approach helps to ensure that the knowledge that is precious to these practice communities in some sense endures through the challenges and erosions that modernity brings with it. No one is going to learn how to practice the forms I describe by reading my thesis. However, calling attention to what a recognised and celebrated master thinks is important gives practitioners as well as scholars a new resource. It might lead practitioners to interrogate or refine their somatic engagement with Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, and it might connect them to knowledge they might not otherwise have been able to access. The choice is with them, but at least the material is there. For better or for worse, placing something in the academy gives it a status that might encourage more people to pay attention to it, or perhaps to attend to it differently. So thank you very much for your attention and for listening to all of that. And I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Lucy, thank you so much for this very rich and interesting talk. It really leads us into areas that we haven't really covered as yet here at the Center for Yoga Studies. Brilliant work, brilliant PhD, and you presumably have plans to publish it, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I'm hoping to turn it into a monograph. I don't have any kind of exact details on how to do that yet, but that is the hope and the plan, and hopefully in the not too distant future, because, yeah, I would like to make the work available to people in a digestible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have time for questions. Jackie, are you monitoring the chat, or do you see any questions
certainly
already coming our way?
So, indeed. So thank you also, Lucy May, for that amazing summary of your thesis. And for those attending, I did pop in the chat window a link to her thesis, which is available online at Open University. But our first question is Ruth Westerby, who we all know very well. So she says, thanks for your fabulous presentation. Please, could you talk more about the relationship between Ayurveda and Siddha medicine in the Kaḻari?
Yeah, sure. Okay. How long have you got? So the northern style Kaḻarippayaṟṛ practices, the ones that come from North Kerala, tend to draw on Ayurveda in their medical practice. Now, the southern styles, so the ones that actually in Trivandrum, where I'm based, because that is essentially where one of the areas for southern style, they tend to be based in Siddha practices. They have a Tamil basis. So the medicine is different, the pantheon is different, and they're actually distinct practice systems. There are various political and social factors that are pushing towards a homogenization, but they are distinct traditions. However, as with many things in the Indian context, it's never entirely neat and tidy. So the Kaḻari that I train at, for example, whilst it sees itself as an Ayurvedic practice, but a specialized branch of Ayurveda. When I was first learning it, Satyan Gurukul said to me that, it's like traditional sports medicine. So it has some like very particular therapies for particular issues. However, one of its most used medicines, which is called, it's now been patented as Kshatantak, so Hindified, and so North Indians can relate to it as well. But it means bruise. It's the bruise medicine. It's what's used on breaks, on sprains. It's a very commonly used medicine, but that actually is a Siddha formulation. So there is an overlap, and how and why they occur, I'm not entirely sure. But the focus on boundaries and definitional categories, they would generally say to you, is not the concern of practitioners. That's for scholars to worry about, and practitioners just get on with doing what they need to do.
Thank you, Lucy. At the same time, I'd like to invite people to type their questions into the Q&A section if they have any more. While we wait for some questions to arrive, Lucy, if I may ask one. So you discuss a lot about the importance of the control of vayu as one of the main aims, I guess. And I wondered, in your research, do you cover, or was it ever spoken of, what the total aim is of a practitioner that succeeds? Is it to become eternal, a longevity of some sort, or control, or a strength in your lifetime, or 100 years, or something like that? Is it ever spoken of what the aim of the overall ideal, practitioner that succeeds at this practice, or does it ever hint at a liberation of some sort? Thank you.
That's a really great question, and I think it's really one of the main differentials between the Kaḻarippayaṟṛ and a yoga practice, because within the texts I was given and within the discussions I've had, there is no overall soteriological, like, liberatory aim in kaḻari. So practice, it's very much aimed at people who are in a community. So it's part of a community process. Kaḻaris are part of communities. They're for householders. Historically, they serve very worldly ends. However, at the same time, they're raising these kind of very potent energies, if you like. And if there are stories of sometimes them being misused and people not ending very well, them going mad or not lasting. But it's more that the practice is seen, if you engage in this practice, it then and you're a good practitioner, it puts you in a good place for then maybe later in your life, if you want to develop a more yogic practice, like, it's not a bad foundation. It's a good start. It teaches you discipline. It gives you certain kind of bodily attributes and focus attributes. But on the other hand, it is not in itself a liberatory practice. It's more like a socially religious practice.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in. So, JB, I read the chapter on Vayu in your dissertation. Can you share how prevalent knowledge or theories of the nadis or varnam are in any specific context of your practice, or whether weaponry, movement postures, or massage? Yeah, it doesn't sort of finishes there.
Okay, so I didn't have time to explain this in the talk, which was already a bit long. But one of the complicating factors in this is that the traditional method of transmission, and it still mainly follows this, is that you don't talk about the theory and the practice. So for a lot of this, I discovered these things when I was talking to Satyan Gurukul. It's not something that's talked about when I'm practicing in the kaḻari. So a lot of these principles came out when I was learning the medical practice and then in discussions for my research. So most practitioners, unless they go and look for it in an alternative context, like your everyday practitioner is not going to come across these principles. They're just not discussed in that way. So the idea is that by doing the practice and by doing the practice correctly, you kind of embody them. But one of the dangers of that is that it's possible for people to embody these principles without knowing that they embody them and without being able to articulate them. And I think one of the motivations for Satyan Gurukul to do this research with me is to find a different way of articulating it, because there is, especially as traditional transmission becomes harder in a modern context because people have less time. So there's a danger of it being eroded. So the idea is that these principles underpin all the practices and that a good practitioner should be embodying them, but they might not be able to articulate it or be aware that they are.
Thank you. Another question. So thank you for your presentation, fascinating presentation. Could you tell the dating of the earliest manuscript on this old praxis?
Well, I don't know how much people here know about Kerala manuscripts, but they don't last very long because they're on palm leaves and the insects eat them. So what tends to happen is you have palm leaves, and then after a certain time they'll get copied, and then they'll get copied again, and then eventually they'll be copied onto paper. So it's very hard to know how old anything actually is. So Satyan Gurukul in his possession has about 100 palm leaf manuscripts. I mean, he reckons that some of them are 200 or 300 years old. I don't know. I have no way of verifying that. The Varakan Patukal, as I said, are the earliest stories we have dating are Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, and they're dated to the 15th or 17th centuries, but most people accept that kaļari is probably a lot older than that. So one interesting and very definite date, though, do I remember it exactly? I think it's 8th century. So there's some epigraphy. So there's a bronze carving. I've lost the term, but never mind. It's in a place called Kantalur. It's in Trivandrum, actually. It's where I go for my Sanskrit classes. So there's a bronze plaque which describes the rules for a Vedic school in the 8th century. And one of the things it tells them is they're not allowed to carry weapons to class. So it seems to be that if they're telling people they can't carry weapons to class, then people were carrying weapons. So there is some kind of indication of martial culture, but this seems to be in a different kind of context to kaḷari. And there is also a Jain travel writer called Udyotana Suri, who around the same time has this kind of travelogue through the Indian subcontinent, and he comes to the southern tip of India and he describes this amazing place and all these beautiful things and all this incredible learning. But interestingly, the first thing he describes them learning out of a very long list, and before you get to all the traditional subjects like grammar and philosophy and so on, the first thing he lists is the weapons, the martial training they do. So we do have some evidence of a martial culture in the area going back to at least the 8th century, but of the kaḻaris themselves, then it's almost impossible to know. And one of the difficulties of dating things in Kerala is the traditional materials used were wood and palm leaf. So these things disintegrated. It's not like in Tamil Nadu where you have granite that's carved.
Thank you, Lucy. Lots more questions coming through. So from Alexa, this one, thank you so much for your super interesting presentation. Now, would you say Nabi Moolam, is that how I say it? Nabi Moolam has a relationship with Muladhara chakra in the yogic body located in the base of the perineum. You didn't mention any meditation practices that reference the vayu and better control of the body or mind that we find in yoga or Far East martial arts practices. So is meditation part of the practice as well?
Okay, so that's like two-pronged question. I'll do my best to answer. So yes, the Nabi Moolam is defined in the medical manuscripts as a point in Muladharam. I'm using the Malayalam pronunciation, so the nasals at the end. I'm not being Sanskritic here. So it's a point inside Muladharam, and it's defined as 2 finger widths in front of the root of the door of the anus and 2 finger widths behind the root of the penis. So essentially and for women, my sense of it practicing is it's kind of just under the perineum. But that's its literal definition in Kaḻarippayaṟṛ. So yes, you're correct on that. As to meditation practices, I think different kaḻaris probably have different practices in a modern context, but in ours, certainly there are no overt meditation practices taught. However, historically, they talk of like upasanas, and in upasana in that context, they mean austerities, penances, that warriors before they went into like battle to the death, and it literally was duels to the death. They were these kind of ceremonial ritual duels. They would go into the kaḻari and they would go through these various, what exactly they were, we don't know, but the understanding is it was probably a lot of mantra repetition, fasting, restriction of food, of water. So there were those kind of practices that were sort of focusing and energizing and to prepare you to battle to the death, basically.
Thank you. We have lots more questions coming in, Lucy, so we'll keep going. From Josh Coe says, thank you. I was introduced at a fairly early age to Buddhist esoteric martial arts, and my teacher emphasized Indian roots of many modern Oriental martial arts. There were inner teachings and methods what looked like fighting techniques to outsiders. The connection to India was through Kshatriya, armed fighting systems, and often Nata practices were mentioned as containing intricate movements that were later to become entertainment or symbolic. Did you find some connections between Nata and martial arts?
I'm not sure what you mean by Nata. So maybe you can...
Yeah, maybe you could type that in there.
So
we can. But otherwise, is there a sense, I guess from your study, localized study, that these methods traveled outside of India? Do they have that sort of within the mythology?
Okay, this is a controversial topic, but I will tell you what I found. So if you go to Kerala and you say to them you do Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, everyone will say to you, oh, it's the mother of or father, depending on who, of all martial arts, and Bodhidharma took Kaḻarippayaṟṛ to China, went to the Shaolin temple, and from Kaḻarippayaṟṛ, Kung Fu emerged. However, the Chinese sources completely refute this. So there's no doubt that Bodhidharma went from South or India somewhere to the Shaolin Temple and lived there, but there's no record of him teaching or practicing any martial art. So I'm not saying that nothing traveled from India, but it didn't travel that way. But that is very much part of the sort of nationalist narrative about, India's contribution to martial arts, but the Chinese will have something else to say on that subject.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Yeah, so another question coming along, because we have a few more waiting. So thank you, Lucy, for a wonderful talk. And thinking about lineage, tradition, authenticity, and modern evolution of ancient practices, what would be the lineage holders of this form? Well, what would lineage holders of this form think of Westerners that then incorporate the essence of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ into yoga or performance? Do they support this, or is it considered to be a watering down of the traditional transmission? For instance, modern yoga lineage does not seem to have to be imperative as it once was, unfortunately. So what are your thoughts? Thank you.
They tend to be quite tolerant, and it's not just in the Western context that it gets appropriated into performance traditions, because a lot of Indian artists and movement artists will incorporate elements of Kaḻarippayaṟṟ. So it has a long tradition in India as well as more recently in the West. So, and it's also been used in movies and so on and so forth. So my sense is they're quite tolerant of this, and sometimes they're quite encouraging of it. What is seen as more problematic is, and it's become especially prevalent with social media, as many of the same debates that you have around like yoga and authenticity and what's the real yoga, but a lot of these more subtle principles that I'm trying to discuss in an age where things are going out on social media and people want to do like flash weapons and big jumps, and you can push your way into those. It's possible to circumvent a lot of these much more tricky and principles that take much longer to embody than somebody who's quite acrobatic and can do a big jump and a split. But actually the spinal movement often gets lost and the details often get lost. And there's also, you see in some instances, like people doing a kind of MMA, Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, like justifying it in terms of why it's a useful self-defense, and it becoming very violent. And I have reports then of Kaļari gurukals amongst themselves, because they talk to each other on WhatsApp groups and whatever, being really quite concerned about some of these developments.
Bharatanatyam is the Indian classical dance that was being referred to as Nata.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, no, that makes, I've got you, thank you. Do I see connections between, but actually, no, I don't see much connection between Bharatanatyam and Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, is the quick answer to that. I have studied a little bit of Bharatanatyam, not to the point of being particularly adept at it, but and Bharatanatyam dancers do sometimes use Kaḻarippayaṟṟ, because Kaḻarippayaṟṟ actually features in a lot of Indian artist training systems. So, for example, Kathakali performers have some Kaḻarippayaṟṟ as part of their training, and it features into other Kerala art forms. So there's that tradition of it being like a good basis from which to practice your other form.
Another question. So thank you for your amazing perspective on Kaļari, Lucy. Even though now mainstream Hindu religion took over and merged Kaļari under it, it's said that Kaļari existed long before and is a foundation for the ancient form of Taiyam. Is that point of view considered? Could this give more insights into how value plays a key role into the things that are not visible?
So definitely when I'm talking about things that are not visible, well, unless we're very trained yes, I did refer to value. So you've absolutely got me there. I was at a Taiyam a couple of weeks ago because I've not long come back from another bout of fieldwork. So thank you for that reminder and that question. So the interesting thing with Kaļari is that it is in this kind of Shaiva Shakta pantheon, but there were historically and always have been both Muslim and Christian kaḻaris in Kerala. So you might know that Kerala is one of the most religiously mixed states in India. So about 60% of it is Hindu. And I haven't got the exact proportions, but it's roughly 20% Christian and 20% Muslim. And both these communities also had kaḻaris. And I think it's Christina Bailey, the scholar from Cambridge. She writes about the relationship between the Naya Hindu kaḻaris and the Christian kaḻaris, and basically how British colonialism kind of screwed it all up. So it's hard to pinpoint just how much indigenous practices, including things like Teyam, kind of filtered through. It's something I'd really love to learn more about, but I think I just need to spend a lot more time on the ground and looking at these different practices. At the moment, you kind of go and see things and you get hints, but it's very hard to have a sense of, you know, what came when.
Thank you, Lucy. We're all out of questions, but I had one last one for you, which is about, you talked about in the opening of your presentation, a little bit about those who were accepted and trained, and then it was sort of a little bit of selective selection of students that would go on to other things. I just wondered now, in contemporary kaḻari, is there a sense of closure, or is everyone accepted? Anyone invited to practice? Or is there still a sense of some sort of not so much secrecy, but rather having to prove yourself before you can be invited into practice?
It's a little bit of both. So on the one hand, most kaḻaris are open to most people or all people, but you do have to apply. But one of and I've spoken to several gurukals about this now, but the relationship with the gurukal is still considered absolutely primary. So, for example, two students can start at the same time, but they won't necessarily be taught the same things. So you'll probably learn the same basics, but once you get beyond that, it's very much down to the relationship with the gurukal and the intuition that the gurukal has. And this text that I worked with on how the gurukal chooses a student to give the Gudha Vidya, the kind of secret or higher knowledge to. And there are three factors that the gurukal is supposed to look at in the student, and that is their bhakti, their devotion, their gurutvam, their commitment to the lineage and tradition, and their hridayam, their like heart-mind. And this in combination with their practice. So that in itself is complicated enough. But on top of all of that, what this is supposed to do is light up the Atman of the Guru. So only the Guru can tell you if you've lit up his Atman. So in theory, yes, it's open, but then the details as you move through are very personalized.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. It was an absolutely fascinating, riveting, and respectful presentation, and I appreciate you sharing your PhD research. And we very much look forward to inviting you back over the next few years, perhaps, as you move through your next postdoctoral research with the Mantrans project in Vienna. So thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.